Since styling with CSS is about putting things in a box and then defining what's going to happen inside of that box, it makes sense at this point to really talk about how you can control the box. And so the box model is the term we use for this, and it just means what are the different ways you can affect it, and then how much space is it going to take, because that's very important to understand as you apply this box model to your layout.
Totally, for sure.
And so that's why we're going to take a look at these changes we make, how they affect the actual width of the box, and then how they affect how much space you need to leave them within the layout, which is reflected by the required width. So the box you see on the screen currently measures 800 pixels wide. We aren't going to deal with the height, we're just going to talk about the width. So right now, this box has a width of 800 pixels, and the space required in your layout would be 800 pixels wide. Now, there's different ways you can affect this box. You can add padding to it, which adds space to the inside of the box. You can add margin to it, which adds space outside of the box. And you can add a border, which also goes to the outside of the box. All of these things affect not only the size of the box, but obviously the amount of space that's going to be required for it to fit in your layout. So let's start off by looking at this box as a container, which is what it is. And right now, this container has text in it. Well, it's not a good idea to have your text go right to the edge of a box like this, especially if your box is filled with a color. So I would like to add a little bit of padding so that it isn't touching the edges of the box, which makes it kind of hard to read. So what I've done here is I've added 50 pixels of padding all the way around. Now, how will this affect the size of the box? Well, kind of makes sense that if you're adding 50 pixels on the left and 50 pixels on the right, then the width of your box is going to become 900 pixels instead of 800. This also increases the space required in the layout to 900 pixels as well. But most importantly, what happened is that my text is no longer touching the edge of the box, which is exactly what I want it to be. So now our box is 900 pixels wide. Now, what if I wanted to add a border to this box? What would that do?
I don't know.
Well, I've just added a 5-pixel border. And so the border goes to the outside of the box. So in other words, it's going to add 5 pixels on the left, 5 pixels on the right to the actual size of the box. And so again, that will be reflected in the space required in the layout as well. Okay, one more thing to cover. Margin. What if you wanted to add margin? Well, what's the difference between padding and margin might be a question you would have.
I don't want to know.
Well, padding is generally used to do what you saw with the type. It's like we didn't want the stuff inside the box to be touching the edges, so we'll put padding inside. Think of padding as you would think of a package that you're shipping. If you're putting something fragile into a box and you're going to mail it, what would you add to the inside of the box to protect that item? Well, you would add padding. Margin, therefore, is the opposite. It is adding space outside of the box. And typically the reason you would add margin would be to push things away from each other. So imagine there's a box to the right of this and you didn't want the two boxes touching. Well, you would add margin to the outside of this box to kind of push the other box away. So margin's a little bit different in the fact that it really doesn't affect the size of the box itself. The box is still going to measure 910 pixels wide. But the margin has to be taken into consideration because obviously it affects the amount of space that the box takes in the layout, because nothing can get closer to it than the margin will allow. And so this is where it can get a little bit confusing as you're figuring out what size your boxes should be and how much total space you need. You just need to take all of these things into consideration. So we started off with an 800 pixel box. We added 50 pixels of padding on either side, so that then made our box 900 pixels wide. And then we added a border, which added 5 pixels on the left and the right, bringing it up to 910. And so that ends up being our total box width. But then by adding the 50 pixels of margin on the left and the right, we upped the required space in our layout to be 1010 pixels. pixels. So those are kind of the basics of the box model. You will be using this a lot in this class because this is how we're going to define our div, put them in the position we want, and have them relate to each other in a particular way is by adding these attributes.